Well, I think the first point is that President Obama's remarks actually make perfect sense in the context of a policy of strategic patience, namely that we're going to wait them out. We're going to wait for them to go away. And that's part of what strategic patience is about. I don't know if that's our policy anymore. It's very difficult for me, even as someone who's in Washington, to figure out exactly what U.S. policy towards North Korea is. We seem to have shifted somewhat, and we have more of an openness to having discussions with North Korea. But the shift doesn't seem to me to be sufficient to really move down that road, vigorously. So I myself am very confused about what U.S. policy is today. Secondly, in terms of evaluating the past 5-6 years, let's start with the beginning of the Obama administration. I think our policy has been a disaster. I think that it has not had any effect on the North Korean nuclear or missile programs, that they are poised to expand rapidly over the next 5 years, that we have not been able to put sufficient pressure on North Korea to shift course, and that overall the effect has been that North Korea has used the past 5 years to put in place the foundation for rapidly expanding its nuclear program, and also for seeking the acceptance of other countries of its status as a nuclear power. So to me, this has really been a very bad policy. I hasten to add that, of course, we all know that North Korea is very difficult to deal with. This is not an easy issue. But the point is that for a policymaker in any country, no matter what the hurdles are, you need to figure out what approaches might be effective. In this case, the approach has been totally ineffective. Idea has been around since the Soviet Union collapsed. When the Soviet Union collapsed, everyone thought North Korea was going to collapse. And it wasn't just North Korea. People thought China was going to collapse. I mean, there were all these different theories about who was going to collapse next. And of course, none of it has ever happened. I don't know why people think North Korea is going to collapse. But I think the main point here is that we have consistently underestimated the durability of the North Korean regime, consistently since the 1990s. So there have been many periods when this idea of collapse that the idea of collapse came back. It became in style. I remember after Kim Il-sung died, and there was a survey done of former South Korean directors of the NIS about how long Kim Jong-il was going to last. And most of them thought he wasn't going to last at all. They thought months, maybe. And in that same time period, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency basically said North Korea was going to collapse soon. Over and over again, people say this. So I'm not sure why it keeps coming back, except I think it's sort of a fantasy we have, that one day this problem will be solved, North Korea will disappear, and everything will be great. But you can't base policy on fantasies. And that's the bottom line, really. Yeah, I know there are a lot of meetings of government officials to talk about the nuclear issue and resuming six-party talks, and everyone talks about how they support denuclearization. But we have a saying in the United States that talk is cheap. So I find that the reality is very different from the, kind of public presentation that everyone is working together to solve this problem. The reality is that all these countries, including South Korea, have different objectives and different interests. Japan, South Korea, Russia, China, all different interests. And you can see that. It's reflected in actions. So, for example, Russia may talk about how denuclearization is important, and indeed I believe that concept does have an effect on Russian policy towards North Korea. It limits what Russia would be willing to do with North Korea. I don't think Russia would sell North Korea major weapon systems. On the other hand, Russia may say it's interested in denuclearization, but it's also pursuing a lot of different initiatives with North Korea, that political, economic, and other initiatives, regardless of what North Korea does with its nuclear program. So to me, that undermines the objective of denuclearization. China certainly talks about denuclearization as an important priority, but it has other priorities, and everyone knows what those are. They're very clear. So Japan, South Korea, you could argue the same thing. So my perspective is that, in fact, regional cooperation is not that good. That everyone is going off in their own direction, and that because of that, it creates a lot of space for North Korea to continue to move forward with its WMD programs, while also building political and economic ties with other countries, which is the worst of both worlds for us. We want them to choose. Isn't that what our leaders say? They have to choose between building nuclear weapons and economic development. Well, they don't have to choose. And I think there are lots of examples why they don't have to choose. I don't know how to fix all that, honestly. It's very difficult. But what I would say is that, at least in the past, the United States was the glue that held together all these different countries. The United States managed to bring them all together and mobilize them to a large degree, but not entirely, behind that main objective. But right now, the United States is not in a position to be the glue. We're on the sidelines. And I think it creates a good, if you're a North Korean, it creates a very good environment for you to get everything you want, your nuclear weapons and economic development. They're not separable. I think it's a big mistake for people to look at it that way. They're really not separable. I assume when you're talking about non-proliferation, you're talking about stopping the flow of nuclear weapons, nuclear technology out of North Korea to other countries. They're not separable. And there's a very simple logic behind that. The simple logic is, as North Korea acquires more nuclear technology, as it builds more nuclear weapons, it's going to have more goods to dispose of overseas, more nuclear goods overseas. If I have one nuclear weapon, I'm not going to be selling that to someone else overseas. I'm going to be keeping it for myself. If I have 100 nuclear weapons, okay, maybe if I had the chance, I could sell 1 or 2, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. It's a very simple logic, and indeed, when we reached the 1994 agreed framework, that was part of the logic behind that. The fact that our intelligence estimates were telling us that North Korea might have up to 100 nuclear weapons by the year 2000, and our concern that that would facilitate nuclear exports by North Korea. So it's a very easy logic. Your chances of stopping the flow of nuclear know-how and technology out of North Korea to overseas decreases as their stockpile and capability grows. The priority is the WMD program. There's no doubt about it. As I said earlier, we've just completed a study actually at Johns Hopkins that we're going to release next week. And there's no doubt that over the next 5 years, North Korea's nuclear program can expand enormously to the point where in a worst case scenario, and I emphasize worst case scenario, North Korea could have almost 100 nuclear weapons by 2020. Now people may ask, well, so what? They can't eat nuclear weapons. They're not going to use them to attack South Korea. But there are a lot of implications of having nuclear weapons that go well beyond their military uses. There will be implications for military strategy, for the joint US-ROK strategy for dealing with the possibility of a North Korean attack. There are geopolitical implications for the region and managing our alliances, US alliances in the region. There are implications for non-proliferation. Those I think are pretty obvious. So the list goes on, and there's also implications for South Korean government and its policy of reunification, seeking reunification. It's beyond my imagination to think that a North Korea with 100 nuclear weapons will have any interest in reunification along the lines of the policies advocated by South Korea. North Korea is going to want to have reunification on its own terms. So there are lots of different implications of this. Well, there are a couple of points here. The first point is that we need to step back and think about what the problem is and how to deal with it, and stop being paralyzed by that kind of thinking. I've seen this for the past 6 years at least in Washington. We've been paralyzed by the thinking that, oh, North Korea needs these nuclear weapons for regime survival, therefore they'll never give them up. Now, if you and I had been meeting in 2009 and you had made that assertion, you may be right, but now the problem has gotten much worse over the past 5 years. Over the next 5 years, it's going to get even worse. So what should we be doing? Should we be paralyzed and just walk away from this issue because of that logic? Or should we be trying to deflect North Korea off its current course? And maybe, at the very least, making this problem not so bad as it's going to get. But we're not doing that. We're not paying any attention to this problem. So, you know, we need to drop this logic that's paralyzing us, and it plays right into the North Koreans' hands. They want us to be paralyzed. They want to be unimpeded. You know, I think when we engage in Track 2 meetings with North Koreans, we meet with a certain group of North Koreans from the foreign ministry. I think these people represent one strand of thought in Pyongyang. And it's probably a strand of thought that is more favorably inclined to dialogue than other people in the government. That's the first point. Second point, if you approach these discussions recognizing that reality, you can learn a lot about what these particular groups of people are thinking in terms of diplomacy. So, you know, in our Track 2 meetings, which have taken place, I guess, I'm trying to remember how many we've had. Since summer of 2012, we've had 5 Track 2 meetings with the North Koreans. And we got a very complete picture of their views on what they'd be willing to do in terms of dialogue and what might happen if dialogue were to resume. You know, I thought it was very interesting. It was a pretty complete picture of what they were thinking. And so in that sense, Track 2 meetings can serve as a good channel of communication. On the other hand, I have no idea whether what we learned was different from what the U.S. government knew or not. The U.S. government was not very open in terms of talking about what it knew. As a general rule, though, I think the U.S. government felt these meetings were not useful and indeed felt that some of the people in our meetings were being fooled by the North Koreans. That's not a very good attitude, but, you know, I found there were a number of government officials who acted that way. It's in everyone's interest, to some degree, that North Korea not have a lot of nuclear weapons and not even have nuclear weapons. But I think at the core of this issue has to be North Korea, the United States, and South Korea. Those are the 3 countries that are key here in terms of dealing with the nuclear issue. And I say that because from a North Korean perspective, it's the United States and South Korea that are the real security threat. So in order to get at the nuclear issue, the United States and South Korea have to be actively involved in dealing with these core security problems. Russia, North Koreans don't care about Russia as a security threat. China, not really. Japan, not really. So those are the key players here on that particular issue, and also on other security issues like replacing the armistice with a permanent peace arrangements too. I don't think South Korea can take leadership on this problem. I think you know, there are some issues South Korea can, of course, take leadership on, like trying to move forward with inter-Korean dialogue. I think South Korea can play a very important supportive role in terms of trying to get the 6-party talks back on track. And certainly, you know, the United States and South Korea would have to work together very closely on, you know, any initiative for replacing the armistice. South Korea could play an important role in trying to plug up the holes in the sanctions regime. You know, if we take regional initiatives in places like Southeast Asia where the sanctions regime is not enforced well, and North Korea imports a lot of technology through Southeast Asian countries. So there's a lot of things South Korea can do. The problem is no one's really doing any of these things. Our policies are a lot of talk. Someone said, someone described our policy to me as talking loudly and carrying a small stick. Which is, you know, Theodore Roosevelt used to say, you know, I forgot, speak softly and carry a big stick to describe how the U.S. should conduct policy. Our policy is talking loudly and carrying a small stick. Let me make a couple of points here. First of all, the choice of an overall strategy is not a choice between engagement and not engaging. That's often the way it's depicted in the media, and that's an incredibly simplistic way of thinking about how to shape a policy towards North Korea. A policy towards North Korea should indeed be forcing them to make a choice between nuclear weapons and economic development. We should be looking for ways to sharpen that choice for them. Right now, we're not really doing that. So that means a number of different things. It means, for example, thinking about sanctions and how we might make them more effective. It means, okay, what about China? Our policy in trying to get China to support what we're doing over the past 20 years has been a total failure. But we continue to do the same thing. We keep pushing China to support more pressure, and they keep pushing us to support more dialogue. So we need to think about how to break that logjam. An effective policy may require additional military measures to safeguard the security of the United States and particularly South Korea. I don't mean attacking North Korea, but I bet you there's a lot more that can be done on that front. And finally, effective policy means diplomacy. It means having an effective, active, aggressive diplomatic strategy. Should we have rejected the recent North Korean initiative on linking exercises to nuclear tests? I say we should have rejected it because it's an unreasonable position. The trade-off was unreasonable. I wouldn't suspend exercises for suspension of nuclear tests, but are there counter-proposals we might have made that would have served our interests? I think there were counter-proposals, but they weren't made. So we need a combination of all of these things, and we need to become serious about dealing with this threat. And I can tell you from 20 years of dealing with the North Koreans that they are very serious people. They know what they're trying to do, and they're going about it in a very steady, consistent, serious way. And quite honestly, we're not being serious about dealing with this problem. We're not paying close attention. We're not trying to put in place more effective measures on all of those fronts that I mentioned. That's what we need to be doing. You know, we can get into a lot of details, but we're not doing that. And it only gives North Korea a lot of running room to build a large nuclear arsenal and to become a state that's effectively accepted as a nuclear weapons state by other countries.